Welcome, Verse. It is CC1004, and I think it's time we had that talk. A talk that every man has in his life. Sci-fi tanks. In particular, we're going to talk about a gap of capabilities that we have in Star Citizen. As it stands, we have one tank, beautiful Umbral Land Systems, Nova Tonk. She has issues. To start off with her positives, he's a massive tank. Definitely would be a heavy tank today. With beautiful size 5 cannon. And really dish out DPS with 40 rounds. Can stay in the fight. Autoloader, which looks like it's in the bustle. And it has twin laser Gatling guns for both anti-air and infantry roles. Additional twin-mounted missile launcher systems, primarily, at least lore-wise, for anti-air roles, which is a much larger concern in Star Citizen with the proliferation of spacecraft. However, her biggest con is her raw stats. Just about every dimension is currently twice as big as a main battle tank in modern day equivalents, such as the M1 Abrams, the Leopard 2, or the Merkava, typically comes to mind. And that poses a logistical issue that currently does not exist. There is not enough scale in Star Citizen, 50 people a server, and a handful of planets, a handful of moons. No incentive to deploy the tank unless you're going to stride around in a forest like here. But it can only be transported by the heaviest lift ship we have right now, that is the C2 and the M2 Hercules. And they can only carry 2 tanks, which is not even a full troop. And I would argue that a troop is the smallest echelon you can have for independent maneuvers. What I mean by that is if you unload a Hercules, there's not enough firepower in those 2 tanks. Have one unit or one tank engage the enemy, the other one try to flank or maneuver around to secure an objective or eliminate the threat. And in modern day doctrines, I think smallest maneuver element, much like an infantry squad, is a troop. And depending on which country you're looking at, a troop is either 3 tanks or 4 tanks. Sometimes you hear about 5 tanks, but that is typically the exception, and in those situations it's that troop is being attached with a mission-specific vehicle, minesweeper, a bridge layer, another tow vehicle, or just another tank, depending on the mission profile, but you would typically train with 3 to 4 tanks in it. And that gives that troop an ability to engage whatever threat it needs to 2 tanks. It will lock down that threat, while the other 2 tanks will attempt to flank the enemy forces or eliminate that threat there. But with having C2 only able to carry half of that troop, that means C2 will have to land in the LZ, deploy the 2 tanks, and those tanks will loiter around at the landing zone, not able to effectively combat the enemy, as the Hercules goes back, picks up the other 2 tanks, ferries them back down, and deploys the other 2. Then the troop can roll out and maneuver on the objective. That is a lot of downtime, making a tank deployment not an effective option reacting to a threat. And that might be fine if you have one patch of land and you're in a very defensive mindset. You just come down at your leisure before the battle happens, deploy as many tanks as you have. But when you start thinking in the scale of a solar system, with our 100 or so, a galaxy system, I guess, where we have our 100 planets, it probably will be having, for 100 solar systems, several planets on each of them and several moons on top of that, and where engagements will be spanning across planets and across solar systems. Being able to only deploy 2 tanks per Hercules either means you have to have a lot of Hercules to deploy a sufficient number of tanks to engage your threat, or your forces will have to make do with a limited amount of vehicles and they cannot react effectively to a lot of threats. Which poses a question of
Did you put a paint on
where
the bottom,
is
or
our
just...
light?
Oh, that's weird.
And in a modern day context, this idea of quick reaction light vehicles, something that cannot brawl with other tanks, but can be transported on normal road systems, it can be transported on medium lift aircraft, is regaining popularity. If you can look at the Japanese Hitoroko Shiku Kento Sentosa, or its Type 16 maneuver combat vehicle, which I'm just going to call it Type 16 today, is being built in conjunction with the Hitomaru main battle tank, Type 10, whereas the Type 10 is being deployed to Hokkaido on a defensive posture against northern invasions, as well as Kyushu on southern main island. But their problem is it can only be maneuvered by train, which Japan lacks a sophisticated rail system to maneuver them to all of the islands that they have to defend, or heavy lift planes. Only a few can be delivered at a time, and Japan has none domestically. So they've developed the Type 16 to be delivered by their native-born medium lift airplanes, and they can be transported across roads, and they can react to any threat just about anywhere in Japan while that battle is happening. As you can see from this demonstration video, this is a Type 16 maneuver combat vehicle, and it's not even a tank really, it's an armored car with a tank gun. Its armor can't withstand any modern day tank round, only rated for 30mm auto cannons at the front and 14.5mm machine guns on the side, but it carries a 105mm gun, which is really good for engaging some tanks, but primarily non-tank armored vehicles, as in a support of primarily infantry actions, and where you are in an area where you can deploy an armored car with tank-sized firepower against an enemy who doesn't have tank-sized firepower. That's a huge advantage. And something like this is exactly what Star Citizen, the Type 16, is tiny. But it carries a small tank gun, and you deploy it with your infantry to react to a new threat. In that Type 16, it's going to engage, armored personnel characters, infantry fighting vehicles, any type of short-range artillery gets to, infantry fighting positions that the enemy has dug, like bunkers, foxholes, buildings that they are hiding in, while its primary threat is riflemen and their anti-infantry or their anti-tank weapon systems, which, while there's no vehicle today that can withstand, say, a javelin attack, the javelins are so few among infantry, and these are so cheap, easy to redeploy, that you could still overwhelm the enemy with just Type 16. In addition, Japan obviously has islands with really soft terrain, lots of mountains, that makes deploying a main tank like the Type 90 and the Type 10 that Japan still has very difficult. Whereas this Type 16 can deploy on just about any type of terrain you can think about and still be combat effective. It can go along mountains and go along soft ground and it won't get stuck. Oh, nice infantry fighting vehicles like us. I don't know what those are. Nice to see those. Still deliver overwhelming firepower against a threat right now who only has APCs and IFEs. If you're working in conjunction with your dismounted infantry, you will carry the day. And that brings us back to the issue with stars. While the Nova Tonk is perfectly fine in a defensive mindset in good, flat, open fields like we see in our Microtech, there are places, say Clio and Aberdeen, that are very rocky. Yeah, Clio. Very rocky, very mountainous, where this is not going to be combat effective. If you deploy them, they're not going to be able to maneuver on the terrain. You have to go through too many death loops, death corridors such as canyons, single file along the mountainsides. That's not an issue that's going to happen with the Type 16-esque vehicle. And in Star Citizen context, what platforms do we already have that are sort of like a Type 16? That is, you would think of this the Spartan, but the Spartan is also still too large. It is very awkward to drive on rocky terrain. Probably the best system we have is the Ursa, which is a ground exploration vehicle. It's hardly a fighting vehicle, as is with the repeaters. The best they can do is angrily object that the infantry, while it pulls out of the fight and lets its 6 dismounts carry the day. But if you were to take the Ursa chassis and take out all of its internal components and just replace that with a hatch for the driver and the commander sit in the hull. The whole back cabin is just components that you can access from the outside. Shouldn't be any interior space, which is another flaw with the Nova Tonk. That it has a lot of wasted space. There's literally a hallway in this tank, which is one of the big reasons why it's so huge. And then it has a size 4 or a size 3 cannon and a turret hatch for the gunner. And sits at the back of the tank, and it's just about the length of an Ursa and a little bit taller, but now you have a vehicle with less on paper fighter power, but you could fit 6 in a Hercules, fit 2 in a Carrack, you could fit, I think that's the only Carrack, 1 in a Constellation. So not only do you have a more maneuverable vehicle that has comparable firepower to the Nova Tonk, you've increased the amount you can carry on your Hercules, and in the event that the Hercules is too expensive of an asset, or the landing zone is too risky to gamble a Hercules delivery on, you've also expanded the fleet of vehicles that can deliver this. And being able to load 2 of these Type 16 Ursas, or as sure we'll call it that, onto a Carrack, which may just be acting as your AWACS vehicle. AWACS. When a battle breaks out, let's say on Clio, when you're fighting primarily on Hurston, you can just take that Carrack and drop these 2 these 2 Type 16s off, and deploy them immediately into the fight instead of trying to recall one of your Hercules out of Hurston, load up 2 Tonks, and then fly to Clio and deploy them onto adverse terrain, most likely. Or if you do have the Hercules on hand, you can load a troop and a half worth onto 1 Hercules. Or load just a troop's worth, so 4 of these Type 16 Ursas, maybe a ballista and a Spartan or a couple Cyclones instead to do as a reconnaissance unit. So now you're diversifying your payload and delivering more relative firepower, as well as deploying cheaper, more expendable assets. And obviously this is not going to have the survivability of the tank, but it's going to be significantly cheaper to deploy. If you were to take, the monetary value of Tonk, get 2 Type 16 Ursas per Tonk, you have a better expression of money in relation to the amount of threats you can react to and you can plug it out with. Whereas if someone only has 2 Tonks, you can maneuver around that. If I don't want her to fight your Tonks on the plains of Cleo, I'm not going to deploy to the plains of Cleo. I'm going to go to somewhere where your Tonks can't go. Where if you have 4 of these theoretical Type 16s, you can chase me down while still defending this one place at Microtech. You can send 2 more to engage me as well in a cheaper deployment craft. And that's one of the things that Starship needs as scope begins expanding, ground combat becomes prevalent. That you might be thinking, why do we even need ground vehicles when spacecraft will be able to, engage any ground objectives you need. That is assuming that your bomber will always get through, and it probably won't. Your enemy's going to have ballistas, and it's going to have other space vehicles too that are going to object to any of your air presence. And even an arrow is twice as expensive as a Tonk. So you're most likely gonna take your bombers, especially your A2s, but your Eclipses, you're gonna take your fighters and you're gonna start reserving them to where they have clear corridors to engage the enemy. As well as the fact that you have to think about the space battle that's happening as well. And if you can't secure that space, you need to think about the air battle before you can think about the land battle. And all your fighters are going to be up in space, protecting your spaceships, protecting your landing craft as they come down, and fighting off the enemy in atmosphere and in space. And you're not going to have any more planes to engage ground with. Whereas if you can deploy more ground tanks, you can secure ground objective without having to gamble your space or air battle. And having a Tonk will allow you to maybe engage one, but having more light tanks is going to allow you to contest multiple objectives, multiple fronts, which is far more valuable than fighting one place with overwhelming firepower. One of the big main philosophies of strategic and logistical warfare is using just the minimum force needed to carry the day. And while tactically, you always want to fight your enemy with overwhelming firepower, it is far more advantageous to penny packet out the minimal amount of needed forces across a larger area to secure more ground or defend more ground than obliterating a small portion of your enemy in one area, sacrificing the rest of the front. As soon as your enemy takes the AO next to the one where you deployed all your heavy tanks to, now you're going to be flanked and eventually encircled, and your tanks are gone either. Having these light tanks, deploying more of them, most likely be a more effective option than just deploying a few tanks, obliterating it. However, as I said, the Nova Tank is going to be very useful in defense as a heavy tank, where you're going to prepare the battlefield before it happens. You're going to basically leisurely deploy these heavy tanks where you can afford to shuttle 2 at a time per asset, where the air and space still isn't contested. And then when the enemy starts deploying their vehicles, already have the overwhelming firepower on the ground with ballistas to support the anti-air ability, your ground infantry, your mules, and other cargo vehicles to supply this ground force independent of a higher echelon logistics networks that's going to be needed to fight the space air battle. And that is going to end up being the primary role of the Tonk, is to fortify places defensively, but you're not going to deploy them the way it is often the offensive maneuver. Of course, this is all theory crafting, and we're looking at the 300-meter target per se years down the line. But if you could start wargaming today of how to refine your logistical networks, we're going to win Star Citizen before the wars even begin. And this is, the things I've said here today aren't only going to be applicable to Star Citizen, but you see them in other sci-fi games. Space engineers, or of a large space engineers campaign. And while people had the ability to build battleships and cruisers and carriers, destroyers were almost built exclusively. You can build 2 destroyers a day compared to the cruisers 1, or the battleship who would take a couple days to build 1 battleship. And while the destroyer only had light armor in this server, only had 1 capital grade gun, having more of them ended up proving to be more beneficial than having a few heavier cruisers and battleships in a few areas. And on the last note before we sign off, there's still a lot of gaps in ground combat capabilities that are missing. We don't have a Bradley equivalent, the Spartan with its 2 Gatling guns. When it deploys its 8 dismounts, it doesn't have the firepower to sustain a fight. It's going to be withdrawing as fast as it can. We missed any type of force multipliers on ground units. I don't know if Star Citizen plans or CIG ends up developing artillery platforms, something like the M109 Paladin, to support ground combat, or if they expect us to relegate starships to lower echelons, but having artillery to call or support fires more accurately and more quickly at lower echelons combat is still highly valuable. But we do need diversity in light armored vehicles, instead of just having 1 overly big, overly heavy tank that we can't deploy in sufficient numbers.